everybody. Welcome to Crime in Court. This is the Delphi trial transcript. We are reading through Indiana versus Richard Allen in the homicides of Libby German and Abby Williams. And we are on the state's case, part 15, and we are going to start heading into forensic pathologist territory here with Dr. Roland Kohr. So let's get started. We left off in last night's episode was Stephen Mullen, who's been recalled now, I think 2 or 3 times, and he's only on very briefly about, to discuss like very specific things. And then, then they shoo him off the stand. And then we also heard from Sarah Carbow, who was one of the witnesses who she's the one who said she saw the muddy and bloody guy, who we now know she never said blood until her third interview with law enforcement. Every interview prior to that was just muddy. She called him muddy. And it wasn't until the final interview when she changed her stance and basically just called him bloody the whole time and not muddy. So she totally flip-flopped there. So we went through that in last night's episode. Now she's off the stand. Let's dive into it. Dr. Roland Kohr. Please hit the like button. Also, if you haven't done so already. Let me make this bigger here. Excuse me. All right. So direct examination of Dr. Roland Kohr is going to be done by Mr. Nick. No, sorry, Luttrell. Who's Luttrell? What's his first name? I don't know. Can't think of it. Jim. It's Jim Luttrell. Okay. And he asks, or he says, "Good morning, sir." Good morning. Would you tell the jury your name, please? Dr. Roland M. Kohr. And he spells it. He spells his last name. Can you tell the jury what is your profession? Currently, I am a semi-retired forensic pathologist. I do fill in work still to cover autopsy services for my former associate. I do independent consulting with civil and criminal attorneys in various other jurisdictions in various locations across the country. I am also the forensic medical director and laboratory director for the Indiana Donor Network. What does the pathologist do, sir? Pathology is a subspecialty of medicine or a specialty of medicine. Literally, the word pathology means the study of disease. A typical pathologist in most hospital settings would be the person that oversees the laboratory, that looks at specimens under the microscope, examines things removed at surgery, who's responsible for ensuring that blood tests and urine tests, things of that type, are run properly and accurately, and then just overseeing the lab functions according to governmental standards. A forensic pathologist, would you describe that for the jury, please? Certainly. Forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology, of which there are several. The basic hospital pathologist is usually considered an anatomic pathologist and a clinical pathologist. Forensic pathology is an additional subspecialty, subcertification that applies the principles of pathology and medicine to the field of law, so as to make interpretations available to examine causes of death, injury patterns, things of that nature. Would you describe your educational background, please? Following high school, I attended Indiana University in Bloomington for 3 years, receiving a Bachelor of Arts degree in biological sciences. I then attended the Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis for 4 years, receiving my MD degree. Following that, I did a 1-year general surgery internship at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, at the IU Medical Center, and then a 4-year anatomical and clinical pathology residency at Methodist Hospital of Indianapolis. What did that residency and the last 4 years, you said, what was a what? A combined anatomical and clinical pathology residency. A residency. Would you describe for the jury what that consisted of? What was your experience in the residency? Okay. A resident is basically an apprentice position that's learning the ins and outs of a given specialty. So, during the 4 years of that training, I spent 2 years in clinical pathology, 2 years in anatomical pathology, getting gradually increased levels of responsibility. So, on anatomical pathology, we would examine specimens as they were removed at surgery, whether it be a gallbladder, a colon biopsy, entire organs removed, such as breasts for breast cancer or colon for colon cancer. That also included autopsies, and during the course of my residency, did in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 autopsies. The clinical pathology side of things involved looking at the basic laboratory operations. So we were experienced in clinical chemistry, clinical microbiology, hematology, blood banking, toxicology, coagulation, things of that nature. And again, you're given increasing levels of responsibility, shadowing established positions until your final year. You're kind of given almost free reign, but still with a somebody to oversee, making sure you're not overstepping and misdiagnosing things. After completion of the residency program, what did you do? What was your next phase of your profession? I received a job offer and took a position as an associate pathologist at Terre Haute Regional Hospital in Terre Haute, Indiana, where I served as the associate pathologist to a more senior pathologist for 9 years. So he was an associate pathologist for 9 years. Following those 9 years, the hospital board of trustees appointed me as the director of laboratories over my previous supervisor, and I remained in that position as director of laboratories for the hospital up until my retirement from full time practice 3 years ago. During that time, I was a pathologist in Terre Haute. I was encouraged by various entities to consider running for coroner based on my experience on having done autopsies and understanding disease processes. And so during the course of the 1988 election cycle, I ran for and was elected coroner, taking office in January of 1989. Since that time, I served a grand total of 4 terms of 4 years, each as Vigo County coroner. Because Indiana law limits constitutional offices to 2 consecutive terms, I did 2 terms, set out 2 more, then ran for 2 more terms, but continued to do autopsies for the Vigo County Coroner's Office and eventually for 16 or 17 other counties in the area, including several in Illinois. Shout out, Illinois. We're neighbors. So does that make sense? A lot of people in Indiana work in Illinois. A lot of people in Illinois work in Indiana, and vice versa. I mean, I just said that. Dr. Kohr, I'm not sure you covered it or not, did you have a time where you did emergency room medicine? Part of my training in general surgery was stints in the emergency department at what was then called Wishard Memorial Hospital, the county general hospital for Indianapolis. But then, because of that and my general surgery experience while I was doing my pathology residency for those 4 years, I had a moonlighting position where I worked as an ER physician, basically did about 10 weeks of full time practice in the spring of 1980, and then continued to do 2 shifts a month for the next 4 years. Have you been a teacher? I have. Explain that for the jury, please. What teaching experience do you have? Well, as a medical resident, you're involved with teaching of students that do clinical rotations on the course of the things they do in a medical center setting. But after becoming coroner, I was approached by faculty members at Indiana State University who were interested in me teaching a course in death investigation in their criminology department. So I ended up teaching for roughly 20 years with a title of Associate Visiting Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice, taught a 3-hour course, 400 level and 500 level, So he's teaching like high level courses. This is graduate level courses. So it meant upperclassmen as well as graduate students on basics of death investigation. Since then, I've also served as an instructor for the Indiana Coroner's Training Board for roughly 10 years. As a pathologist at the hospital, we also had medical students that rotate through at various times, so we would entertain students for month long rotations, basically one on one, them shadowing me for the course of the month. Above and beyond that, I've always made it available that law enforcement officers, others in training for things such as paramedic, EMT, could attend autopsies to learn the basic anatomy, and I've had relationships with several of the nursing schools in the Terre Haute area. In fact, as recently as 2 days ago, I had nursing students observing one of my autopsies. So I'm still teaching, just not with a formal title and not getting paid for that part of it. Have you been asking to provide any leadership, sir, in any leadership in the area of child protection and child death investigations? I have. I was appointed to the original Indiana, see, what's the exact title? Child Fatality Review Team, which was back almost 20 years ago. It was formed and was one of the original members of that group. We review essentially every childhood death that occurs in the state of Indiana. After about 7 years in that position, the governor at the time essentially cleaned house and named all new members. But as of about 5 years ago, I'm back on that committee. So I'm serving as the lone forensic pathologist on the state Child Fatality Review Team, as well as two subcommittees of that, one of which is the Sudden Expected Infant Death Investigation Subcommittee, and then an advanced review team composed of myself, some geneticists, and multiple specialists from Riley Children's Hospital, as well as the Department of Health. Over the years, have you collaborated with the Indiana State Police in providing training and teaching to crime scene investigators? Well, by the nature of the way I do autopsies, I'm always trying to teach while we're going through things because various people see certain situations infrequently during the course of their careers, and so whether it be city police, a town marshal, county sheriff, or state police, I'm always kind of going into teaching mode as if we see something of interest during an autopsy. Because of that, for a time, the person who was in charge of training of crime scene investigators or evidence technicians for the state police, who had been one of those himself, started sending all of the recently trained and ready to enter practice, such as graduates of their program, to me, and I would spend basically a half day with them, primarily to describe how they are to interact with county coroners, because county coroners in Indiana have a great spectrum of qualifications, the legalities of dealing with those who has control of a crime scene versus who does not, as well as ensuring some keys from the basic types of injury patterns we see. But so that's been kind of my semi formal process with the head of the training program for the state police CSIs, as well as ongoing informal training whenever they're in the room. You mentioned your coroner experience, Dr. Kohr, and that would have directly led you to visit and be present at crime scenes, at death scenes. Is that correct? That's correct. Many forensic pathologists confine their work to simply the laboratories. Is that correct? It's correct. Part of most training programs, though, requires that the pathologist, the forensic pathologist in training, do attend some crime scenes just to understand what goes on, what takes place. When I became the elected coroner, until I was confident in the abilities of some of my appointed deputy coroners, I would go to most of the major scenes myself, not necessarily to every natural death, but if we had something unusual in particular. For the first several years, I attended every single homicide, and fortunately, since Vigo County does not have an overwhelming number of homicides like a Marion County or a Chicago area, I still, shout out to Chicago, I still kind of made it a point whenever I was available, if I was in town, if we had a homicide, and I would attend it just because, based on my experience, training, etc. Sometimes I see things at scenes that other people don't, or if they see them, they don't recognize the significance of. So, that extra set of eyes is always helpful because it may be something that nobody else felt was significant. And what is an autopsy, doctor? The word autopsy literally means to see for yourself. In common usage, it is a medical examination performed by a medical professional which involves external and internal examination of a human body, although it rarely can be similar things done for animals. It involves collecting of evidence as necessary, removal of the organs, dissection of the organs, collecting of blood samples and other body fluid samples, preservation of samples for further examination under the microscope for looking for microscopic changes, and then submitting samples for toxicologic and other chemical testing, and then putting all those bits of information together to render a final autopsy report with an opinion as to the cause of death and, based upon the circumstances provided to us, as to the manner of death. My next question, you probably covered it, but I want to make sure I understand the sequence. When you perform an autopsy, what are the phases or stages of the autopsy? Okay, well, I kind of gave a brief overview. The initial stage we do before doing an autopsy is A, we have to be contacted by a legal authority requesting the autopsy. Now, when I was a coroner, I was my own authority, so that was not an issue. But when I've not been seated as the coroner, that has to come from either the coroner or a deputy coroner, and for all the other counties I worked with from the representatives from their particular offices. But they would contact me, indicate they're interested in having me perform an autopsy, and then we would make scheduling arrangements to work it into whatever the workflow was. I would try to get as much possible information relevant to the case about why we were doing it to start with, and then at the appointed time we would go to the morgue. Oftentimes, if it was a criminal investigation, we would have in attendance officers or members from the coroner's staff, and then we would proceed with removing the body from whatever transport medium it had been in, whether a body bag or wrapped in sheets, placed on the autopsy table, and then if it's wrapped in sheets, pulling the sheets back. If it's in a body bag, opening the body bag, then observe the body, the condition it's in the body bag before anything else is touched. We photograph if necessary, make note of clothing, whether there is evidence of outdoor activity such as leaves, dirt, debris, etc. Once we've done those sort of things, we will then take the body out of the body bag and place it on the autopsy dissection table. And again, make notes of anything that now is apparent that was not apparent earlier, and we will document things such as hair color, eye color, clothing that's worn, jewelry that may be in place, obvious wounds, blood, other signs of trauma. Sometimes the trauma is extremely obvious, such as misformed legs because of severe fractures, blood covering the body from various types of wounds, and we will document those before we start cleaning or removing anything else. Once we have documented those things to my satisfaction, we then proceed to undress the body and then take another round of photographs and notations. So we cut a lot of the clothing. We look at the clothing to see if there may be holes in the clothing itself, such as from bullets, knives, whatever it may be, just tearing. Of course, during the course of this, if we get a body that is affected by other natural phenomenon, such as an insect activity, maggot activity, other insects that predate onto, human flesh, we will make note of those as well and collect samples as necessary. Once the body is undressed, again, it is photographed, examined for wounds that are sometimes not apparent with the clothing on. And then one more step is we will then clean the body. Sometimes blood will obscure various types of wounds and kind of make it impossible to tell where the bleeding is from. But we will rinse down the body again, make note of any obvious wounds. Now, one step we will usually do before cleaning the body, though, is if we have to collect evidence for a sexual assault, that will be done before we wash things away, which may be pertinent to that examination. We know that there were SA kits done to the girls, so that's an important thing that he's noted here. Um, he says that that will be done before we wash things. So they did the SA kit before they wash the girls. They'll be done before we wash things away, which may be pertinent to the examination or which may be contaminated by free flowing water, like DNA, causing things to run onto various orifices or cavities that otherwise would not be affected. Well, let me stop you there, Dr. Kohr. We'll talk in a bit about the exact components of the Indiana State Police Evidence Collection Kit, the SA collection kit. But that process of examination and collection of samples is done prior to any real movement or touching of the body, certainly any cleaning of the body. Is that correct? Well, things such as collecting hair samples, fingernail scrapings, and so forth, yes, that's done before doing anything else. Obviously, if we're going to be doing a sexual assault, eventually we're going to have to remove any clothing such as pants, panties, and so forth to get to those. But as things are exposed, we will collect them at that point. And once the examination, the external examination of wounds or the body, is there anything else about the external examination that you wanted to describe before I interrupted you? We will, again, we will do measurements. If we have obvious wounds, we will document where on the body they are. And I usually have a small worksheet I work from that I do very crude drawings because I am certainly not a trained medical illustrationist, but indicate, the type of wound I believe them to be, whether stab, incised, gunshot, entry, exit, things of that type. I will take note of where they are in the body relative to other anatomic landmarks. Typically, in a gunshot wound, I will say they are, so many inches below the top of the head, so many inches to the right or left of the midline, what a trajectory is, whether it appears to be going front to back or back to front, things of that nature. We will, on certain occasions, if we're worried about projectiles such as gunshots, we will at this point have x-rays obtained, and that's why I've always insisted on doing my autopsies in a hospital setting is because I have ready access to portable x-ray equipment. They can wheel the x-ray machine in, take a photograph, and I'll have results within a matter of minutes instead of having to wait days or weeks to get those back. Once all those sort of things are done, then we proceed to start collecting samples. And by samples, for toxicology, we will usually take a blood sample from the femoral arteries and vein. In my preference is the left leg, just because I'm right-handed. I work on the right side of the body and I'm reaching forward. It's easier to access that for myself. The reason we take blood from femoral vessel rather than the body cavities in most cases is it is less contaminated sample in terms of having potential for erroneous results. Less contaminated from what's contaminating it? That's a confusing sentence to me. He takes the a blood sample from the femoral artery because it's less contaminated in terms of having potential for erroneous results. So, why would anywhere else on your body have more potential for erroneous results? I don't get that. He says there's a phenomenon recognized by forensic pathologists called postmortem drug redistribution, which means after the body dies, drug concentrations, which may be evenly distributed throughout the bloodstream, will start to shift, and the longer it sits, the more they may shift. Okay, so now that makes sense. But still, because the large blood vessels in the chest are next to the liver, which can concentrate certain types of drugs, we try to avoid that. They're also very close to the stomach, and things like alcohol can just passively diffuse from the stomach into surrounding structures. So there's a risk that we may get an erroneously high value if we take a blood sample for toxicology from a central location. So by going to a large peripheral site, such as the femoral artery and vein, we can get a decent sample that's not going to have those contaminant protocols. In the event of not being able to get adequate blood from a peripheral site, though, we will sometimes be forced to take it from a central site. Just, we'll have to take the best we can get. But those samples are collected, and once those samples have been collected and placed in appropriate containers, we will then begin the dissection. Okay, so he explained that. That makes more sense now that I heard his explanation. And that involves an internal examination. And that internal examination, does that allow you to see more full the extent of any wounds that are visible on the exterior of the body and perhaps understand the nature or the cause of the death more fully? It does. And again, this is basically a medical procedure, a dissection, as it were, where we open the chest cavity, the abdominal cavity, remove the rib cage anteriorly so we can observe the organs in their positions, note how they appear, whether they appear normal versus disease versus disrupted from whatever cause may be going on. One of the last things we do after doing the chest and abdominal cavities, we will do the head and we make incisions. And all of our incisions are based in ways that they can be camouflaged so as not to impede an open viewing during a funeral service. So the typical incision we use is a Y-shaped incision on the chest and abdominal cavity, although the way I was taught, it's more of a goalpost as opposed to a Y shape, a standard Y shape. The incision we make on the head is we go from behind one ear across the top of the head to behind the other ear. We can peel the skull or the skull forward and back, take off the top of the skull to remove the brain, and then put things back together again so that they are not readily visible to anyone viewing a body. I don't know how they're able to do that, but bravo, I guess, for being able to cut people open entirely, take out organs and stuff, and then be able to sew them back together, glue them back, whatever you do, and then have them still be visible for a funeral viewing is kind of insane to me. And what they do and what the funeral director does, getting them to look, you know, more like themselves when they were alive is pretty amazing what they can do. All right, so we will remove each organ in stepwise fashion. One of the other things I do in the course of my dissections that I was taught in my training program, which I know not everybody does, is I will isolate the three main blood vessels that are in the neck area, specifically the arteries, by tying large strings around them. Now, the reason we do this is because it facilitates superior embalming results by the funeral directors. That's just a, medical courtesy we're doing for their behalf. It takes a couple extra minutes for me to do, but it makes a world of difference for them in terms of how they can make the body presentable. So I will isolate the right subclavian or subclavian artery, the right common carotid artery, and the left common carotid artery, again with large strings so that they're easily found, and they proceed to remove the various organ structures in the body. Take out the thyroid gland, which is in the neck, the heart itself, the lungs. We then proceed to the abdominal cavity, We will remove the intestinal structures, followed by the liver, spleen, pancreas, stomach and esophagus, adrenal glands, kidneys. Then that gets us down in the pelvic area. Once we have access to the pelvis, if it's male, we'll take a urine sample, feel the size of the prostate. If it's a female, we'll observe the female reproductive structures, including the uterus and ovaries, and also take urine samples if urine's available. We will open the aorta, the main vessel in the main large artery going down the center of the body, to look for evidence of atherosclerosis or other injuries. And then, as everything is removed, it is set over on a separate dissecting table, and I will then subsequently dissect each and every one of those organs, looking for specific abnormalities that they may have. While I'm doing that off to the side, I will first make my scalp incision, and then my autopsy assistant will provide with removing the top of the skull and preparing it for me to remove the brain. So that way, we're both doing something the same. It cuts back on waiting for one another to proceed to the next step. So as I dissect the organs, the first thing we've done is we've weighed them to see how they compare to what a normal standard reference would be. I will then observe them for how they feel, the coloration, whether there's masses or other abnormalities which I can recognize, and then I will take dissecting knives and cut into the organs in regular intervals so I can look at the insides of the organs, not just the surfaces. I will then collect tissue samples from each of the organs placed on the formaldehyde container, because those are what we will then use to make microscopic slides with down the road, what we'll make microscopic slides with down the road. And then usually by the time I'm finishing up that, we're ready to, they're ready for me to be able to remove the brain. That will also be weighed and then also dissected in a sequential fashion. I kind of really like this doctor so far. He's just matter of fact, to the point, like it's gory stuff we're talking about, but there's no reason to act like it, like this is matter of fact. He's just like, this is what I do. I place the guts on the table. I place the brain here, like like he's just matter of fact. This is his everyday, and I'm for it because I hate censorship. I hate how we can't say certain words on YouTube because this is learning. This is science. Like, I don't understand why we can't say these words, but anywho, here we are. All right, so let's move on. Thank you, Dr. Kohr. How many autopsies have you performed in your professional career? Holy crap. Right now, it's between 7,700 and 7,800, and I don't know the exact count at this moment. Have you testified in court before? I have. And in a number of jurisdictions? I've testified in probably a dozen to 15 jurisdictions in the state of Indiana, 4 different jurisdictions in the state of Illinois. I've testified in by Zoom in the state of Montana, in person for civil cases in California, and in, I believe, 5 or 6 different federal courtrooms, both in Indiana and Illinois. In criminal cases, you've primarily testified on behalf of the prosecution. Is that correct? I testify on behalf of whoever sends me the subpoena, and it primarily is the prosecution. And you have testified, however, and been contacted and consulted with criminal defense. Is that correct? That is correct. I'm going to hand you what's been previously marked as State's Exhibit 123 through 137. Prior to that, however, uh, let me ask you a couple of questions directly, sir. Were you contacted on February 14th, 2024, excuse me, 2017, to conduct autopsies the following day, the following morning, in relation to the deaths of Libby German and Abby Williams? I was. And did you perform those autopsies on February 15th, 2017? I did. Showing you these images, would you look at these and tell us, have you seen those before, and do you recognize them, and are they accurate depictions of what they purport to show? I recognized them as photographs that were taken during the course of the autopsies of the two young men, or the two young women in my autopsy facility in Terre Haute. I'm going to show you a photograph 222 without displaying it to the jury. Have you seen it before? I have. And is 222, he means, not 224, is 222 a close up that you cropped to show a portion of the injuries displayed on State's Exhibit 135? Yes, it is. Would these photos assist you in describing to the jury your examinations and the opinion that you drew? Yes, they would. You were present when the state police crime scene investigator took a number of photographs. Is that correct? The ones that we've just been shown to me, yes, I was present for all those. In fact, my hands or my body are visible in some of the photographs as well. And those included both external and internal examination photographs. Pretty much. Not these that I've shown you, but the ones that they look at, or the ones that they took. You've reviewed those, correct? Yes, I have. And did you help select the ones that would be pertinent to your testimony? I did. And they do not include any internal examination photos? Correct. I would move the admission, Your Honor, that conditionally accepted but not fully of the photographs 123 to 137. In addition, I would ask leave of the court to move for the admission of the close-up photograph 222. The state offers the exhibits. Mr. Luttrell says 123 through 137. Did you say I said another number? Mr. Rosie says, I heard 222 and 224. Are those? I just want to make sure. The court says 222 is the new one. Mr. Luttrell says 222 is the new one. I believe I misspoke. Mr. Rosie says, okay. All right, that's fine. May I? The court says, yes. Mr. Rosie says, Judge, the defense would renew its objection based on 403 with the understanding that our position is that they're more prejudicial than probative. So we'd ask that they be excluded based on the conversation we had had yesterday or maybe the day before at this point. Thank you. The court says, and based on the completion of the foundation, I'll show 123 to 137 and 222 admitted over objection. Mr. Luttrell says, that was 123 through 137 inclusive? Yes, sir, she says. Mr. Luttrell says, thank you. Dr. Kohr, in this particular situation, the morning of Wednesday, February 15th, 2017, you did conduct two autopsies, correct? Correct. Could you describe to the jury what your practice is when you do multiple autopsies in terms of what you do once you complete the first autopsy and in between intervening times between the two? Well, generally, I follow the same approach regardless whether I'm doing one autopsy on a given day or three or four. Once I have completed the autopsy itself, during the course of the autopsy, I first filled out my worksheet, which will include, before any types of dissections are begun, noting things such as clothing, height, estimated weight, obvious wounds. During the course of the autopsies, we weigh the organs. We will record those on a dry erase board in the actual autopsy room. Once my dissection has been completed, I will take off my protective garments, transfer the weights that are listed on the dry erase board on my worksheet, and then go back to my office while that case is fresh in my mind and I can generate my preliminary report. And what I do is I use a computer template because for a significant number of the autopsies we do, certain parts are very, very similar with the exception of weights. 90+% of the spleen I examine look the same. The only difference in, Sam Jones versus Bill Smith is how much it weighs. And so I can use a, 2 or 3 sentence description of what it looks like, as long as it's normal. Fill in the weight and go forth. But I will do that in a case of this type so I can fill in the blanks pretty readily. It expedites turning out a report, but in areas where there needs to be free text, such as a circumstantial summary, description of injuries, description of other abnormal findings, then I will free text those as needed to produce an essentially 5-page preliminary report, which is then available for law enforcement for whatever purposes they may need it at that point in time. When you did, let's talk about the first autopsy you performed that morning. I believe it was on the body of Abby Williams. Yes, sir. And did you note her height and weight? We measure the height with a ruler, and this is literally length rather than height because they're laying on the table as opposed to standing upright. But we measured her length at being 64 inches, and my weight is an estimate based upon having done this for 30 plus years, being able to correlate height with basic body build, and I estimated her weight at approximately 95 pounds. How do you or how are you able to do that in your 30 plus years? How are you able to look at her height or length and say she's about 95 pounds based on her body build? Did they not weigh them? That's confusing to me. Okay. And did you document the clothing that she was wearing? I did. What clothing was she wearing when she arrived at the autopsy? There was a black hooded sweatshirt. There were a pair of blue jeans, a gray and black sports bra, and a rust-colored camisole. Between the sweatshirt and the gray sports bra, was she wearing a garment? The camisole. The camisole? Yeah. When you conducted the internal examination of Abby Williams, what did you observe that was of note to you? If we're talking about the internal examination of the body cavity, it's really external. Okay, external. Once we get, she did say internal, but okay. Once we get the body cleaned enough to observe the source of the blood, because there was some significant blood on the anterior neck area, we were able to describe a solitary transversely oriented incised wound across the neck, predominantly on the left side of the neck. The way the wound first appeared when we measured it was 5 centimeters in length or roughly 2 inches. Now, soft tissue being such as they are, when you make an incision across certain muscle groups, the muscle fibers underneath the skin will cause it to retract. So, in this case, since we have muscle fibers that tend to run vertically in the neck, this incision caused the two edges of the wound to kind of gape and or gap and pull it apart. So, at that point, it was probably 2.5 inches wide. And one thing we do in the course of this to get a better feel of what it was before the pulling apart, we will then stretch the skin to make this a more or less flat or linear incision, then measure it in that condition. When we did that, the wound was 6.5 centimeters in length, or roughly 2.75 inches. Was that the only wound to the neck you observed? It was. Are you familiar with we spoke about the Indiana State Police Evidence Collection Kit. Did you utilize that kit in the collection of samples? I did. That kit includes a blood standard, does it not? It does. A vaginal wash. It does. What do you do in the vaginal wash? Well, what we will do initially as part of the examination and what the kits are is it's basically the size of an almost small shoebox, but it will have a number of envelopes that are all numbered, as well as collecting devices such as Q-tips, syringes, things of that type. And we will just start pulling out the envelope one by one and go first with envelope number one and see whatever it says is to be collected. And I think the first few are have to do with things that can be just, hair plucked from the scalp, pubic hair pluckings, if necessary, swabs taken on external surfaces, and so forth. At some point, we will then go ahead and do a vagina examination and take swabs with Q-tips as well as anal swabs. And then Once that is complete, we will take a syringe filled with sterile saline, inject it by a syringe, and then whatever residues are collected and then mixed in with that fluid, the saline, we then suction back out with a syringe and place in a test tube. So basically, they insert the syringe into the female part, and then if there is seminal fluid or anything that is left behind, that will mix with the saline when they flush it back out, and then they should have a DNA sample. So that makes sense that they do that. I never knew that they did that, so kind of interesting. All right, so in addition to the vaginal wash, it would include a vaginal cervical swab. Yes. An oral swab. Yes. An anal swab. Yes. External genital swab. Yes. An internal genital swab. Yes. Fingernail scrapings. We attempt them depending upon what the length of the nail is on the person. With regard to Abby Williams, do you recall? I'm trying to remember which of the two ladies had it, but one of them had been a nail biter, and we had very, very short fingernails, such that it was the case of Abby Williams. Basically, the nails were so short, it was very difficult to get any type of scrapings because there really wasn't any surface underneath them, like on a normal person's nail that it's not a nail biter. So they couldn't even probably get like clippers underneath there or scissors or whatever, nail scissors, whatever they might use. And as you indicated, head hair combings, we will do combings to get hairs that are not officially attached that may have been transferred from another source. There is also combings done by the pubic hair and then plucking from the hair that will include roots as well. And these are all inside this box, the individual container marked with what the sample is to be. Correct. And you simply follow through with that examination, one by one, putting a sample collected. Yeah, in that appropriate envelope. The evidence technician will basically hand me envelope number one, and I'll see what it is. We'll collect that, put it in, he will seal it, and then move on to the next one. Was there any indication of sexual injury to Abby Williams? I did not see any overt injury patterns such as abrasions, lacerations, contusions, or anything like that that would suggest any type of traumatic sexual contact or damage being done to her genitalia. No. Does that mean that there was no sexual contact or touching involved? No. Just it means that there's not enough to have left any type of wounds. Obviously, consensual activity that people perform all the time does not leave wounds, and presence of various lubricants will also avoid having wounds left behind, but I could see nothing to indicate any type of trauma that was recognizable to myself. Other than the wound that you described, the two, and once it was spread, 2 and 3/4 inch laceration, incised, an incised wound. Incised wound. What is the definition of an incised wound? Okay, well, there it is one of 3 different types of sharp force injuries we see and describe in forensics. The 3 different types of sharp force injuries are incisions, which are shallow, or, excuse me, they are longer than they are deep. And basically, from drawing a scalpel across the skin or something like that, you will give you an incised wound or a uh, box cutter in this situation is what they believe to have been used here. A stab wound is deeper than it is lengthwise, and so basically they go down, but not leave quite as large a gap. And then a third type of some sharp force injury is called a chop, and usually it's got a sharp edge as well as some heft to it, so you will see chop wounds, something like machetes. very large knives, axes, things of that type. In distinction to that, a laceration, even though it's commonly misused by everybody, including most people in the medical profession, a laceration, Mr. Luttrell cuts him off and says, and some prosecutors apparently, well, including emergency room physicians and other people, a laceration is a type of blunt force injury. A laceration literally is a tearing of skin causing the edges to separate, and there's a very distinct marking that allows you to determine an incised wound from a laceration. A laceration will have an abraded or roughened edge. It may have bridging blood vessels or nerves when you try to separate it, but they have distinctive appearances that allow you to separate. So if I'm looking at a laceration, I don't want to waste my investigator's time looking for knives because it was not a knife that caused a laceration and vice versa. This incised wound on Abby's neck, was that the only wound that you observed on her body? It was. Did you look for any defensive wounds? I did. Can you tell the jury what you mean by that phrase? Well, with the assumption that a victim of an assault is conscious and able to respond, a natural human reaction is to try to protect themselves in a defensive posture. So, if somebody throws something at you, you put your hands up. And we see this n- uh, not just with people coming at you with a baseball bat or a knife, but even with guns. I mean, people will try to stop a bullet with their hands just because it's an instinctive reaction. So when we talk in terms of defensive wounds, we're usually looking for injuries to the upper extremities, but we can also see them if they're, for instance, lying flat on a bed at the time that they raise their leg up to try to block something. So it's trying to prevent something reaching their body, head, chest, abdomen, by something else such as an extremity. Did you observe any blunt force trauma to Abby Williams? I did not. Did you observe any bruising or ligature marks or any other mark on her body consistent with restraint? Well, we looked very closely at the wrists and ankles for those sorts of things, did not see any. The only thing which we saw whatsoever that suggested a possible restraint or something being applied to the body was there is a very faint linear mark that goes across the face that almost looks like it's the edge of a piece of cloth, especially or possibly a piece of tape or something like that that seems to go across, kind of across the face this way as to cover her mouth. Now considered that Now consider that being from tape, because the width was such between the top and bottom of that it might reflect something like duct tape. But we saw no tape or adhesive residues whatsoever, just this very faint linear mark across the face. Was it more visible in a photograph than it was to you as you were there? It was. So more visible in person than in a photograph is how you would normally word that, but he asked in a weird way. And do you believe that marking was post mortem, pre mortem, or at the time of the infliction of the wound to the neck? Could you tell? Well, post mortem could be any time following death up until the time that I do my autopsy. Pre mortem, there is no pre mortem. There's antemortem. I guess they're calling it premortem. Um, Premortem could be any time before death, things that are happening about the time. We often use the term perimortem, meaning around the time of death. Now, the fact that this is visible, it's faint, I really cannot tell with any type of definitive opinion as to whether this is perimortem or premortem. Less likely to be post-mortem because I can't imagine a scenario why you would do something like that after a death, and that's more common sense than some sort of deep forensic scientific judgment. But that fact that it's so faint, but it's a little more prominent would tell me it is probably in the perimortem period. The likelihood that it so in the process of dying, or yeah, in the process of dying is perimortem. The likelihood that it happened days or weeks beforehand is very unlikely, so this was probably somewhere around the events of surrounding her death. So she probably did have some kind of cloth or something around her mouth to try to keep her quiet. What was the directionality of the wound to the neck? The directionality, what we saw in this case of Abby Williams, was essentially transverse, meaning sideways across this way. And could you tell whether it was left to right or right to left from her point of view? Not really, with any certainty. But it appears more likely to be right to left just because there were some abrasion patterns that kind of suggested were whatever instrument was, attached to the blade may have caused some scraping to the skin as it was drawn across. So my best impression, most likely, is that this was a right to left going from her right to left. So her right to left, and it was on, I think they said her left side of her neck. And did it damage any vessels in the neck? It did. Would you describe for the jury what you observed? There was a partial transection of the left external jugular vein. So that's why it is just an incision, an, uh, an incisor or whatever he's calling it, and why it's longer than it is deep. So it's the the actual defect on the skin looks, it is measures longer in length than the wound does in depth down into the flesh. So that's why, because they hit the jugular vein, so they didn't have to go very deep. All they had to do was this partial dissection of the jugular vein, and now she bleeds out. She bleeds to death. They didn't have to do much. So these people might not have been their first time doing this, looking for a jugular vein, possibly. We can take this time to come back to Abby Williams in just a moment, but I want to talk in terms of your examination of Libby Williams that followed your completion of your notes of Abby Williams. Is that correct? Correct. Was there neck vessel injury to Libby German that you'll be describing in more detail soon? Yes. And what was the vessel injury to Libby? In the case of Libby German, we managed to cause injury to the right common carotid artery, which was a partial transection, a complete transection of the left common carotid artery and external jugular vein. So basically, three major vessels were injured by or in the course of the what was inflicted on Libby. Three major vessels. So all of the right carotid artery, the left carotid artery, and the jugular vein all were damaged. The right common artery was a partial transection, a complete transection of the left and jugular veins. So basically, three major vessels were injured by or in the course of the what was inflicted on Libby. And just for clarification, transection means to cut through. A partial transection is you've partially cut through. A complete transection, you're totally cutting around the vessel. Dr. Kohr, could you describe for us where the jugular vein is located? All right. The jugular vein, obviously, it cannot be seen externally like you can see veins in the back of your hand and so forth, but it runs along a course right adjacent to the carotid arteries. Now, the easiest way to locate the carotid artery in yourself is to put your finger to the side of your neck and you feel the pulsation. And so basically, it's running right under the skin here, usually a depth of only about a half inch or so below the skin line. And again, this is basic anatomy that you learn as a freshman medical student, but it's also something because I deliberately tie off those vessels for the convenience of the funeral directors. I've dissected these out and put the big strings out on them, over 7,500 times during my career. So I examine these essentially every time I do an autopsy. So I know where they are. Excuse me. Got like the hiccups or something. But again, they're not very deeply seated, as you can tell by feeling your own neck. If it was way deep, you wouldn't be able to feel the pulsation, but you can feel the pulsation because it's a fairly superficial vessel. So the carotid artery, there are how many? Well, actually, this is a quiz question that I give the nursing students that they usually get wrong. There are usually three carotid arteries on each side. There's what's called the common which is a branch up here, which then splits into the internal and an external carotid. The external carotid then distributes branches to the face and the musculature around the face and the muscles, whereas the internal carotid artery goes to the base of the skull and supplies blood to the brain. And so you've got common internal and external on right side and common external and internal on the left side. But where we're talking about here, before you get up past the jawline, you're talking common carotid. And the jugular vein is located where in relation to the carotid? Well, right adjacent to the carotid. They're side by side. You got to be careful because if you don't dissect carefully, I may cut the vein, which doesn't make the funeral directors especially happy. What's the difference? Going to basic physiology, what is the difference between the vein and the artery? All right. An artery literally is a blood vessel that's carrying blood way from the heart to the body part, whatever it is. In the case of the carotid, it's delivering to the head, neck, face, and brain. A vein is a vessel which is returning blood back to the heart. Arteries are in larger sizes. Um, Anything really above a capillary or are considered muscular organs. They have a layer of muscle. They're called muscular arteries. That way, they can constrict. When they constrict, they will cause raised blood pressure. When they relax, they cause lower blood pressure, and they have to be somewhat elastic as well because they've got to, the pulsation you're feeling is because they are dilating each time a heartbeat propels blood through them, so they are elasticized. That's one more reason why I tie the strings around them because once I cut them, because they're elastic, they tend to, retract up underneath the jawbone, which again makes the funeral director somewhat unhappy. Veins do not have muscles in their walls. They are very thin-walled vessels, almost paper thin in most, including larger ones. The largest vein in the body is the inferior vena cava, and its thickness is about that of maybe 3 or 4 sheets of paper. So they're not very strong or thick compared to the walls of the muscular arteries, which are a little bit thicker, elasticized, and muscular. The court says, "Excuse me, would counsel approach really quickly?" And we've got a sidebar. The court says, I hate to interrupt, but we need to take a break. Several of the jurors are getting very uncomfortable." Mr. Luttrell says, "Yes." Mr. Rosie says, "Thank you." The court says, "So maybe just a pin where we're at." Mr. Luttrell says, "Sorry." The court says, "I just said maybe put a pin where you're at with this particular witness. Okay, we'll take a break." Sidebar conference concluded. The court says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to take a quick break. I know you've been over there a couple hours. While you are outside of the courtroom, we're going to keep going, so don't worry. Please don't form any final opinion. She gives them all their instructions, blah, blah, blah. Sidebar conference conducted. Mr. Luttrell says, was it something the doctor said? The court says, no, it's just they've been over there for 2 hours. Mr. Rosie says, yeah. The court says, and they were starting to eyeball Jeremy and Jason that they had to go, probably to the washroom. Mr. Rosie said something that's inaudible. We got our first inaudible. It took us a while, but we got it. Um, I guess the uh, court reporter is really honed in when it's like witness versus attorney, but when the attorneys and the judge are just talking, there's an incredible amount of inaudibles. Court says, yeah. Mr. Luttrell says, appreciate it. Court says, yeah, no problem. Okay, sidebar concluded. They go off the record. The court says, and now we're back on the record. And the court says, all right, Mr. Luttrell, we have no defense lawyers. Are you ready? Mr. Luttrell says, I am. The court says, okay. Mr. Baldwin says, sorry, Judge, I thought you said 30, 11:30. 30? I said 15 minutes. Mr. Baldwin says, excuse me. The court says, no, you're fine, you're fine. And I know people have been complaining about the sound. I can't do anything about the sound, people. I'm trusting that the members of the media that have been provided with the best seats in the House are able to hear and can relay that information out to the public. It's important that the jurors hear what's going on and that we had to switch documents here. And that, whoopsies, I was not ready. Sorry. We have to ensure it's important that the jurors hear what's going on and that the parties in the well of the courtroom hear what's going on. And I've been told that the parties in the well and the jurors are able to hear. And I apologize that those of you out in the audience outside of the credentialed media are having a difficult time, but I can't do anything about it. Can you gauge, Mr. Luttrell, about how much longer you think your direct's going to be? Bailiff says, all rise. The jury enters the room. The bailiff says, thank you. You may be seated. The court says, thank you, gentlemen. You may proceed, Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell says, thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 223 and ask if you're familiar with that document, sir. I am. And what is it? It is a schematic drawing of the major vessels in the neck of a human, which I helped select as a potential demonstrative exhibit. I'm handing you what's been marked as 223A and 223L. Are those the same diagram schematic drawings with you noting the location of neck injuries on both victims? They are. And is 223A designated as Abby Williams? Yes. And 223L is Libby German? Yes. Would move the admission of 223, Your Honor, 223A and 223L. Mr. Rosie says no objection. Court says all right without objection. They are admitted. Mr. Luttrell says I would like to publish, Your Honor, the exhibits that we've entered through Dr. Kohr, and if I could have him come down towards the screen and proceed through those exhibits. The court says you may. Mr. Luttrell says thank you. Two things, Dr. Kohr, or three things. I'm going to hand you this pointer, ask you to stand to the side as much as you can so that the jury can see the screen, and then ask you to project your voice to the back of the jurors, if you would, as you proceed. We're looking at State's Exhibit 223, and you described injuries to the carotid artery and jugular vein on Libby, and then on Abby, and the injury to the jugular vein. Would you, beginning with Libby, would you show the jury where you saw transected vessels? Of course, I have to make sure I don't mix the names up here. On Abby Williams. Okay, on Abby. Abby Williams, the one with the single defect. Now, just for the anatomic reference, the two large blue structures here and here are the external jugular veins. Very thin-walled structures, but they are literally drawn in proportion to their actual size. These are essentially the diameter of a pencil, if not maybe a little bit larger. Her injury was right about here in this general vicinity, so a partial transection of the external jugular vein, or the jugular vein, excuse me. About how far below the skin surface is that jugular vein at that location? Roughly a half of an inch. I'm sorry, roughly half an inch. Maybe give or take, an eighth of it, a quarter of an inch. In terms of Libby's injuries, would you show the jury where they were located? Okay, in her case, we have a partial transection of the carotid artery right in this vicinity, and then complete transections of the vein and the artery on the left side. And did you note those on a copy of the schematic? I did. That I just showed for the jury? I did. Mr. Luttrell says, I would ask opportunity, Your Honor, to copy those and provide them to the jury at a later time. The court says, so you would be talking 223A and L? Yes, Your Honor. Okay, you may. And I'm going to stop right here because we will continue on. His testimony is a little lengthy, so we're going to continue on right where we left off. They're going to start going through all of the exhibits and these pictures that they're admitting and describe them for the jury. So we will get into the rest of his testimony next time. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really, really, really appreciate you. And I hope that you continue to follow this journey with me. I think it's important to bring it to light because it was so heavily withheld from the public. So much of it was withheld from the public. So we really need to talk about this. The more and more we talk about it, the better. So and just by talking about it, reading the transcripts, you guys viewing this, it is helping to spread awareness into this case and more cases like it. So, again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Please don't forget to hit the like button on your way out if you haven't done so already. Bye, guys. Take care.